the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio, WYBC, and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. The Republican Freedom Caucus in Congress derailing the repeal and replace of Obamacare. We'll learn about what the Freedom Caucus is all about, and we're going to be joined by a congressman from the Freedom Caucus who's taking on Washington from the inside, seeking to drain the swamp. All of that today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Congressman Ken Buck, Republican of Colorado, serves on the House Judiciary Committee and the Committee on Rules. He worked his way through high school, college, and law school as a janitor, truck driver, furniture mover, and ranch hand. After law school, Ken worked for Dick Cheney on the Iran-Contra investigation and then became a prosecutor with the U.S. Department of Justice, also serving as a district attorney in Colorado, also a business executive for a construction firm. His new book attacks business as usual in Washington, even attacking GOP business as usual. That book, Drain the Swamp, How Washington Corruption is Worse Than You Think. Welcome, Congressman. Honor to have you.
Thank you. It's great being with you.
The book is a gutsy indictment of Washington, particularly for someone who's now an insider. Let me just ask you first. The Freedom Caucus was instrumental in blocking of the Obamacare repeal and replace. And there's some folks that feel that the Freedom Caucus is too rigid. They'll drive the bus right off the cliff. President Reagan might have said, "Get me 80%, and I'll come back for more." Is that a misperception about the Freedom Caucus?
It absolutely is. I have to tell you, the bus is going off the cliff, and if we don't slam the brakes on right now, we're over the cliff. And so, with $20 trillion of debt, it's hardly the Freedom Caucus's fault that we are in the position that we're in. But I think that the Freedom Caucus is very clear that we are all in favor of responsible programs, but we cannot have the federal government continue to run health care in America.
The bill itself, which the estimates were 24 million people would lose their health care or choose not to have it and might shred the safety net, and cap Medicare spending. Was it a bad bill in and of itself that way, or did it not go far enough in your view?
I think we're going to see an improved bill that comes to the floor. The key from my perspective is that we return as much authority to the states to regulate the system. Mm-hmm. Each state in America is different, has different needs, and is able to spend a different percentage of its budget on health care. And I think it's important that the federal government get out of the way and allow states to make that determination. Some states will want a work requirement for Medicaid, and other states won't. And that's really up to the state to make that decision. But the state's going to have to balance the needs of transportation and K through 12 education and health care and others before they are able to make that determination. I think that the mistake we make is the one-size-fits-all plan from Washington, D.C. just doesn't fit everybody.
You said in the book, which I thought was a great point, that you wanted to see open debate on this, which there wasn't when Obamacare was jammed through the system. But then it ended up seeming like Speaker Ryan did exactly that. Are you critical of that?
I think that there's a misperception that this bill is the only health care debate that's going to occur. This is really the first step. And we will see a second step that the administration, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tom Price, will go through. And I think we'll see other bills and other debates and various oversight hearings on health care. So I think there will be more of an open process than we've seen so far. But because there will be no Democrat support for this bill in the House or Senate, we have to use budget reconciliation, and it's a very limiting way to try to pass legislation.
Okay. So hopefully tort reform, negotiating drug prices, crossing state lines, health savings accounts, all of that stuff will get addressed at some point. Now, you talk about this corruption being worse than we think. Tell us exactly what you mean.
Well, one of the things that I found when I first got to Congress was that there are dues for committees. So if you want to be on an A committee like the Appropriations Committee, the Ways and Means Committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee, there's $450,000 of dues that you have to pay to the National Republican Congressional Committee, and the Democrats have the same structure on their side. So what happens is members oftentimes will hold receptions in Washington, D.C., invite lobbyists. Those lobbyists will write a check to the National Republican Congressional Committee, and then the member owes the lobbyist. There is a corrupting influence in that whole process. If you want to be a chairman of one of those committees, it costs $1.2 million. So it is really a pay-for-play system that I think one, it's bad optics, two, it's bad politics, and three, it's bad policy. I think we should change that. So I've written a letter to the Ethics Committee asking them to make it unethical for anyone to consider fundraising in the promotion to an A committee or to chairman.
I think that stuff stunned me. I knew nothing about it. How about 1/3 of discretionary funding is unauthorized? What do you mean by that?
What I mean is, and I use the example in the book of the Endangered Species Act. We have an act that was passed in 1973. It had a 5-year sunset on it. If Congress did nothing else, the act would expire after 5 years. So members voted for it thinking, we'll see what happens, and if it works, fine. If it doesn't work, it'll expire, won't require another vote. It was reauthorized once with another 5-year sunset, and has not been reauthorized since. So since 1984, the Endangered Species Act has not been reauthorized. It has received appropriations every single year. It has received funding every single year. So 1/3, $500 billion of our discretionary budget is unauthorized, programs that should have sunset. Some of them are good programs. Some of them are absolutely necessary. But if Congress doesn't do its oversight and make sure that the programs are effective and efficient, then we have failed. And I think that's it would be a good policy just to say, do your oversight, or these programs don't get appropriations.
In fact, the whole budgeting process, as you describe it, is kind of phony. These omnibus bills bypass essentially any oversight in the subcommittees, and the thing called the chairman's mark allows them basically to control what the budget is. There's $500 billion of user fees and fines that nobody knows where they go or anything. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, the last point that you make, I think, is a great point. When you go to a national park and you pay a fee to enter the national park, that fee doesn't necessarily go to the U.S. Treasury. Oftentimes, these fees and fines that agencies impose on private businesses and citizens will go into an agency account, and the agency then uses that money as it deems appropriate, and it doesn't have any oversight by Congress. Congress is supposed to, under the Constitution, have the power of the purse. If agencies are bypassing Congress by creating these separate accounts, then Congress has no authority over that agency.
Talking about lack of oversight, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Congress has no control over its purse strings, and it is tended to go after big targets that can pay big fines as opposed to maybe who's behaving the worst. Do you have any comments on the CFPB?
Yeah, I do. I think it needs to be reformed. We certainly want to have a financial watchdog in the federal government and in state governments, but we don't want to have an out-of-control financial watchdog, and that's what the CFPB has become. The funding source is the Fed, and there is no oversight. The president appoints, but Congress doesn't confirm the director of the CFPB. So it really is a challenge to figure out how to bring that agency under control without the 60 votes in the Senate. But it's an absolutely necessary step to have more control over any agency in government.
We got about a minute to go in this segment. Is the Ex-Im Bank an example of crony capitalism that's supposed to be benefiting small business but really benefiting actually even a very few number of big businesses?
It absolutely is. The Ex-Im Bank is benefiting Boeing and General Electric and Caterpillar and a few large corporations, but it advertises itself as helping small business. But the taxpayers are on the line, just like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. If the loans go bad, the taxpayers have to pay, and that's a serious problem, and it's a problem we have to deal with and deal with it quickly.
You listen to Business Talk with Jim Campbell on Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. Go to biztalkradio.com, find the station closest to you, listen over the internet, access our podcast. We're going to ask Congressman Buck how we drain the swamp in our next segment. And we're back with Congressman Ken Buck of Colorado of the House Republican Freedom Caucus as well. And his book is talking about draining the swamp. So first off, Congressman, what is the single most important thing that has to get done to drain the swamp?
I think we need a convention of the states. Under Article 5 of the Constitution, there are two ways of amending the Constitution. One, the method that we have used so far in our country's history, where language is proposed and passed by 2/3 of each House of Congress. It then goes to the states, and 3/4 of the states need to ratify that language. The other method that hasn't been used, but I think has to be used in this case, is that the states demand that Congress convene a convention of the states, and that the language is created at that convention, and then 3/4 of the states need to ratify that language. And I think the only way we get a balanced budget amendment passed, and the only way we get term limits passed, is by doing it through that method. I don't think that Congress will ever limit its own ability to spend money or the terms that members serve.
Do you think we have $20 trillion of debt, over $90 trillion of unfunded, if you include health care and Social Security? Do those numbers have to be attacked downward, or we just got to stop adding to it?
The challenge really is how to balance in the long run. We're not going to balance next year. It would be such a shift in our economy that it would cause great disruption.
Yep.
But we can balance in 10, 12 years, and by balancing over time, pay off that debt. The debt is a larger and larger portion of the budget, and it's going to squeeze out many of the essential programs that are in the budget right now.
Okay, how about getting rid of big money? There's a stat in your book that amazed me, that the lobbying spending is about $6 billion, and it yields $4 trillion of benefits in various different ways. How do we get rid of big money?
That's a pretty good investment, isn't it? Wouldn't you like
that's a great investment.
Have that rate of return for your investments?
Yeah.
It's a good question. We have a very well-defined First Amendment right in being able to donate money to candidates. I think there are two basic kinds of donations. One is an ideological donation, and the other is a transactional donation. On ideological donations, people donate money to Ken Buck for Congress because I stand up for their Second Amendment rights, or I believe in smaller government and lower taxes. And so they see those values, they see my voting record, and they support me for those principles that I hold. The other kind of donation, the transactional donation, is I will give you this money if you will vote this way on a bill. Or you vote a particular way on a bill, and then you receive a donation.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of donation I think that people find offensive, and we need to make sure that we reduce that. And there are a number of ways we can do that. The donations to certain committees go up dramatically around the time those committees examine major pieces of legislation. For example, the Transportation Committee members received large donations right before the transportation bill was reviewed in committee. Those are the kinds of things that I think we have to look at and say, maybe you can't donate to anybody from in that committee for a period of 6 months or a year when they're considering a piece of legislation like that. But there can be reforms that minimize transactional giving.
Good ideas. Now, you said in the book that the House is only in session 111 days a year, which is pretty amazing. Talk about how you would change that, and what do you mean by restoring regular order?
I think that the House needs to meet more, and I think one of the things we could do is to meet, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that people don't work when they're not in session in D.C. There's a lot of work that gets done in districts, and it's very important work. But when we're in D.C., I think that meeting from Monday morning to Friday night, maybe even having a floor time on Saturday, so that members have to stay in their in D.C. for a weekend or two a month would be beneficial. One of the ways that things get done, good things get done in D.C. is personal relationships are built and trust is created. And when everybody is flying home as soon as they can to get to their districts and meet with their constituents, which is important, some of that is taken away. So I think it would be beneficial to try to work a few weeks of the month where we're actually not just flying in on a Monday and flying out on a Friday, but actually working the full day.
You call for the inspectors general, which are currently in the cabinets, in the departments themselves, to report to Congress.
Right now, the inspector generals are appointed by the president, by the administration. They're supposed to be examining. They work under the same roof as the department that they are examining, which in some cases is good, in some cases bad. Their budgets are decided by the departments that they work for, and I think that Congress should not accept the recommendations of those departments, but rather do the funding. And then I think the inspector generals should report directly to Congress and not to the department heads that they report to.
You talk about what people can do. One of them is electing candidates of good character. How does that happen?
Well, it happens by individuals really getting involved in the campaign process, volunteering for a campaign, attending rallies, doing your best to learn what drives an individual to run for office. And if we have people of good character in Congress, the chances of them wanting to stay in the swamp too long or wanting to treat the swamp like a hot tub is a lot less. And so I would really encourage American citizens to closely examine those who are running for office. I know people are busy. They're raising families. They're working very hard. But if we get this wrong, our ability to dig out of this hole is going to be very hard.
Are you catching grief or anything for this book? I mean, you're an insider now, and you're critical of the leadership on both sides and on the culture and on the swamp. Are you taking a beating at all, or are people saying, boy, it's good to get this stuff coming out?
Well, I tell you, I didn't have any friends when I got to D.C. I'm not going to have any friends when I leave, and I am really convinced that my role in Washington, D.C. is to expose the corruption and to do my very best to fix this problem. I think if we have a better institution, we will have better results.
Are you term limiting yourself or anything?
I have not term limited myself, but I can tell you, given my friendships or lack of friendships, and given my desire to change the system, I'm not planning on spending a lot of years in D.C. But I think when people term limit themselves, the people who are in favor of term limits leave, and the people who are opposed to term limits stay. And so it is a self-defeating process.
Are you optimistic that Speaker Ryan is going to do the right things over time?
I am. I think Paul Ryan's a great man. I really do. I've had the chance to get to know him, and he is incredibly bright, incredibly principled, and he is right now in a broken system, and I hope he will help fix the system and really help get the incentive structure changed, and that's what I think is so important.
One last thing quickly before we go. What was it like working for Dick Cheney?
Great man. I worked for him in 1986, so several years ago, but he is a wonderful person, really bright, and I now sit next to his daughter on the Rules Committee, so that's a pleasure. Wow.
Generations moving. Well, we want to thank Congressman Buck for his time. It looks like his motivation is definitely along the lines of anybody that supports draining the swamp, which takes a lot of courage if you're an inside. You've been listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Thanks to Congressman Ken Buck. One of the most powerful government offices you've never heard of, OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, responsible for review of government regulations, costs, benefits, unintended consequences. We're going inside OIRA, plus President Trump's regulatory reform agenda. That's all today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. From 2007 through January of 2009, under President George W. Bush, Susan Dudley served as the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which is a part of the Office of Management and Budget, better known as OMB. Currently, Professor Dudley is the director of the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center. She's distinguished professor of practice in the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration. And I'm a big fan of GW. As I've told her, my daughter graduated in 2007 when President Trachtenberg was still in office. And Susan has promised to make OIRA sexy this morning. How are you?
Great. Great to be on the show with you, Jim.
It's our honor. As we said, this is the most important office you've never heard of, known as the Regulatory Czar. Tell us exactly what the function is and why it's so important.
Its function is to review not only regulations, but also any information requests that the government might have of citizens, statistics across the government, and they also coordinate internationally with other regulators overseas. And of course, in Canada and Mexico. It's important because maybe I should just back up and just quickly explain what regulations are. The legislative branch, of course, passes laws. So our elected officials pass the laws, but those laws delegate to regulatory agencies like the Department of Homeland Security or Transportation Security Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration. They delegate responsibility for implementing those laws through regulations to those agencies. And it is those regulations that this office, OIRA, oversees.
Essentially, it goes from Congress to the agencies, and then it has to go through OIRA, right, for a more neutral, dispassionate view of the impact.
Yes. So OIRA is like other parts of OMB. OMB's it has responsibilities for the budget. So OMB obviously coordinates the budget of each agency, and so no agency can go directly to Congress and say this is the budget they would like. They go through OMB, and it's coordinated. The management and performance of agencies is coordinated through the on the management side of OMB. All legislative opinions, et cetera, also go through the OMB. So OIRA's role is like that of those other offices within OMB. It's to coordinate across the agencies, and as you said, and that was actually a phrase of President Obama's, that it provides a dispassionate and analytical second opinion on the agency's actions.
Is it required that the net benefits exceed the costs, or is that a hope?
That's a great question. So OIRA was actually formed in 1981, or actually it was created by the Paperwork Reduction Act signed by President Jimmy Carter in 1980. And its function under the Act, so its legislative function, is to make sure that anytime the agencies or government agencies and departments request information from the public, that this office checks them and makes sure that it's necessary, not duplicative, and the least burdensome necessary. So, for example, on your tax forms, or anytime you fill out a form for the government, you'll see there's a little OMB number, and if it doesn't have that number, you don't actually have to fill out that form. That's what the office was created for. That President Reagan, when he came into office in 1981, also added this new function, and that is to review all the draft regulations from the executive branch agencies. And in that review, he required them to do analysis, the agencies to conduct analysis to understand what the effects would be, regulatory impact analysis, including the benefits and the costs and an evaluation of different alternative ways of approaching it. These were requirements that previous presidents, Carter and even Nixon before him, had generally, but they didn't have this review mechanism to enforce them. President Clinton in 1993 changed some of the terms of it, but essentially kept those requirements the same. So it is that net benefit test. Let's look at every regulation, and especially for the bigger ones, the higher impact regulations, make sure that they provide more benefits than cost, or essentially do more good than harm.
I'm impressed, too, that both Republican and Democratic presidents have stuck with this on either side. Let me ask you this, lest we think this isn't that big a deal. I think you estimated that regulations cost $2 trillion. Is that a year or over 10-year period or something? But it's really a hidden tax.
Yes, people often call it a hidden tax because it is something that, unlike the on-budget, the cost of on-budget programs, we see that in the fiscal budget, we see it in our taxes, but regulations affect the price of goods and services, the salaries that you can get, and even what kinds of things that are available. And so it is hidden. That's actually, that $2 trillion is not my own estimate. I think it's so hard to do that we have not tried to estimate the cost. That is actually originally from the Small Business Administration, more recently updated by the National Association of Manufacturers using academics Mark and Nicole Crane. Another study done by the Mercatus Center, Bentley Coffey and Patrick McLaughlin, actually estimates $4 trillion a year.
Wow.
So they use different methods, and it's hard.
It's very hard. By the way, $4 trillion would be the entire size of the federal budget, wouldn't it?
Yes, yes.
So it's like a double budget. Geez. Tell us, Susan, what you were administrator under the George W. Bush administration. I guess Josh Bolton would have been the OMB, would have been your boss, I guess, and then he was chief of staff. What was your focus then? What kind of an impact do you think you made?
I was the administrator in the last 2 years of the Bush administration, and my focus was mostly on wrapping up priorities and trying to ensure that we didn't issue too many midnight regulations. So there's this phenomena that you can document back to at least the 60s, that presidents at the end, the last few months of their term, especially after Election Day in their final year, there's a rapid uptick in regulatory activity if they try to hurry and finish their priorities. And I came in with 2 years left and tried to smooth that out and say, if we have priorities, focus on them now. I really don't want us to be issuing last-minute regulations that kind of tries to lock in the next president. And you asked me how successful I was?
Sure.
Not very.
But I think your stats, to be you're modest, your stats did show that they've gone down, the midnight regs, since then, right? Am I right on that? Or
I think we were somewhat successful in that we spread it out a little bit over the last year. So if you look at the post-election quarter between Election Day and when President Obama was inaugurated, there were way fewer regulations than the previous transition. But if you look over the year, in part, they were just spread longer over the year, which isn't a total failure, because I think that meant there was more methodical opportunity for evaluation. For the public had plenty of opportunity to comment and evaluate the regulations before they were put in place.
Since the function's looking across the government as opposed to all the silos, do you view yourself as taking on the special interests?
Yes. I think that's a key function of OIRA and the other parts of OMB. They have that cross-cutting perspective so they can see the bigger picture and all the competing priorities for government resources. So I think a key role of OIRA is countering that tunnel vision and the influence of special interests. In
terms of bureaucracy, how long is it take OIRA to get one of these things through their system, approved or not approved, and out the door? On
average, OIRA review takes 60 days. Sometimes it's much quicker, and other times it can be very long. So that average can hide some reviews that last a year or even more. But in terms of the process from start to finish of the regulation, not just OIRA's part, that's at least a year, because agencies do have to, they do some analysis, they develop their proposal with documentation on why, and then they have the OIRA review, which isn't just the OMB office reviewing. It is one of the things OIRA does is coordinate across government agencies. So agencies get to see each other's regulation, and it does help make sure that there isn't conflict or duplication. And then they need to seek public comment. So in the U.S., all regulations must go through public notice and comment, and then agencies have to respond to that public comment and develop a record that.
And I must say, you think of big bureaucracy, there's only 50 career officials or so in OMB. We've got about 30 seconds, so I know the Federal Register, which contains all these rules and regs, is 90,000 pages. There's 300,000 employees, I guess, involved in this. Should that all be shrunken rather significantly? Can it be?
That certainly is one of President Trump's goals, is to shrink that.
Good way to end it, then, because that's where we're going next. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. Go to biztalkradio.com, find a station closest to you. Listen over the Internet, access our podcast. We'll look at President Trump's regulatory reform agenda, an ambitious one, as soon as we get back. We're back with former OIRA Administrator, Regulatory Czar Susan Dudley, now a professor at George Washington University. And I read, or Trump has claimed that within his first 100 days, his regulatory reform has already produced $18 billion of savings. I don't know how you feel about that, but tell us how serious about regulatory reform he is, and start off with, I guess, after that, with the 1 in 2 out, what that means.
Okay. Yes, I've been studying regulation for a long time, and this presidential cycle, there has been more discussion of regulatory reform than I think I'd ever heard before. And President Trump in particular campaigned on cutting regulations. He made some quite dramatic claims about how much he would cut it, anywhere between 75% and 90% of regulations.
Wow.
What he has done in his first 100 days, and I can maybe just divide it into two categories. One is working with Congress. He has overturned 13 regulations that were issued at the end of President Obama's administration, using a statute that was passed in 1996 and only used once before. So, and we can talk about that more if you're interested. That's the Congressional Review Act. And then the second thing he's done is through executive orders, he has directed agencies to offset the cost of new regulations by looking at old regulations and removing them. So his executive order requires agencies to eliminate 2 regulations for every new one they issue, and to make sure that the total cost of those new regulations is no more than the total cost of the regulations that are getting removed.
So essentially he's capping increases in regulatory costs?
That's right.
Which is a pretty big deal.
It is a big deal. I actually think it is the most dramatic change in regulatory process since Ronald Reagan required agencies to submit regulations before they were issued to OIRA.
Let me ask you this. Does OIRA review executive orders, and would the immigration executive order have gone through OIRA, or should it have gone through for vetting?
OIRA does not review executive orders. Okay. Unless it's an executive order that is regulatory in nature. So I'm sure that they had a chance to look at these 2 regulatory, at his regulatory executive orders, but they would not have reviewed that one. They would not have seen that.
Okay. I guess Trump is also calling for regulatory reform officers and regulatory reform task forces. What does that mean?
Yes, that's the second kind of cross-cutting executive order that he issued. So in every agency, he's required somebody to be designated as the regulatory reform officer and a task force of other agency staff that would be the regulatory reform task force. This, I think, is interesting, and it seems more important to me than I thought when I initially saw it, in that agencies are filled, agencies have their mission, which is to find problems to address through regulation. So everyone in the agency is focused on finding the next, developing the next regulation. For the first time, there's going to be a group that is designated that is responsible for looking at existing regulations, seeing if they actually work, and finding which ones might be modified or eliminated.
I find it interesting that President Trump, of course, is making all these claims for progress, but here's an area where it seems very significant that is getting no press even from him. Who is going to head OIRA, right? Because there's not a head in there right now, is there?
There's not. There's an acting person, and the career staff at OIRA are just I just can't say enough good things about them. The OIRA administrator is a Senate-confirmed position, so the president has to nominate someone, and then the Senate needs to confirm them, as you would a judge or a department head. So he has announced his intention to nominate George Mason University law professor Naomi Rao. But her official nomination hasn't gone up, and of course she hasn't had her confirmation hearings and been confirmed yet.
What's her bent?
She's an administrative law professor, very well respected. She runs a center at George Mason Law School. It's actually now called the Antonin Scalia Law School, called Center for Study of the Administrative State. So she has a lot of experience, or she has a lot of academic knowledge. She also has worked in all three branches of government. She clerked for Justice Thomas on the Supreme Court. She worked on the Hill and was in the White House counsel's office in the Bush administration.
Interesting that you just went to Center for Administrative State. I was going to ask, Steve Bannon has talked about deconstruction of the administrative state. Is this what OIRA is going to be about, or?
They focus on the net benefits of the regulation. How can we issue regulation that provides the most good for the cost? So I think one thing that OIRA will be doing in this administration is providing that function. So while they will definitely be needing to work with the agencies, and they'll be coordinating the regulatory offset and the 2-for-1 executive orders, but I think they will be doing so in a way that recognizes which regulations continue to provide benefits and which ones perhaps have outlived their usefulness.
And I think you called for this, and you said it hasn't really been calculated, except maybe SBA. Should we have an accounting of the actual total compliance costs, its impact on the economy every year?
I actually think that's too hard to do.
Okay.
In part because some of these costs are just too hard to measure. So people have called for a full regulatory budget that is equivalent to the fiscal budget. And it sure would be valuable to have. I just don't think it can be done in a way that is principled or would even be as informative as the fiscal budget. Okay,
last question as we get down. Do you feel that there's regulatory overreach? That OIRA deals with that? And when there's a recommendation, for instance, to cut the EPA budget 30%, does somebody tie that back to how that would impact the regs and rules right now that are in there?
Well, that is one advantage of OIRA being part of the Office of Management and Budget, so that there is some coordination across the budget side of OMB and the regulatory side. I can't say what role they had in, how much OIRA was involved in that, in that budget, the skinny budget that has come out. As you noted, it's a very small staff, and they not only have regulatory responsibility, but the chief statistician of the United States is part of OIRA, so all the statistical information goes through that office. Wow. So I don't know the extent that OIRA was involved in that.
Well, it's been a fascinating couple of segments, and you can see OIRA is actually a critical part of both the government and what looks like President Trump's strategies on the administrative state. Thanks to George Washington University professor Susan Dudley. Her website is regulatorystudies.gwu and .edu. And Trump administration's regulatory actions can be found at reginfo.gov. That's reginfo.gov. Thanks to Susan Dudley. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. The tragic downfall of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the inside story from a former CFPB enforcement lawyer talking about one of the key pieces of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Financial Reform and Consumer Protection Act. And that's today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Ronald Rubin was an enforcement attorney at the Consumer Financial Product Bureau, and prior to that position, he was senior counsel and chief advisor on regulatory policy for the House Financial Services Committee. It's on our show a couple of years ago now to talk about the infamous Wolf of Wall Street. And his just published article in the National Review is The Tragic Downfall of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Welcome back after 2 years, Ron.
Thanks. Good to be here. And you got the order a little bit off. I was actually at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau before I was at the House Financial Services Committee.
Oh, I didn't realize that. And you're no longer there at the House job, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay. And it was what you've written is obviously a gutsy sort of inside, almost whistleblower account. Before we dive into that, give folks who may not know exactly what the Dodd-Frank Consumer Financial Protection Bureau even is.
Well, the Dodd-Frank Act was passed. It was a much longer piece of legislation passed after the financial crisis to address a lot of issues, and about a quarter of the law was creating this new agency that was just dedicated to enforcing consumer financial laws that, in a lot of cases, other agencies used to enforce.
And basically, in layman's terms, things like revealing the fine print in a lot of products or mortgage or stuff that may look incomprehensible, simplify credit disclosures. Is that correct?
Yes. The original, Elizabeth Warren in 2007 published now kind of a legendary article calling for an agency that would make sure that people understood their financial decisions. So when you're taking a mortgage, that you understand what it is, payday loans, car loans. That was really the entire proposal. But what it ended up being was discrimination laws, mortgage laws, debt collection laws, and altogether there's 18 or 19 statutes that they enforce. So it ended up being much, much broader than the original intention. So what you described was correct, but as it turned out, was only a small part of what they now do.
Now, before we dive into it, did the idealism was it of an agency like this? Was it destroyed by the swamp?
That's a pretty good final wrap up. I mean, one of the points that I make in the article was that structuring it this way almost guaranteed that it would end up being a political organization instead of a professional organization. When I came to Washington to help build this, I thought that basically we were building a similar version of the Securities and Exchange Commission, where I had previously worked earlier in my career for 7 years. But it ended up, and at this moment I would say it still is, much more of a political agency than it is a professional agency.
So the structure is very unusual and puts the director particularly in a hugely powerful position. He's appointed and funded independently of Congress, right?
Yes. Well, he's appointed by the president and has to be confirmed by the Senate. So unlike other agencies, which is what there was a recent case, which you'll probably ask about later, this is one of those rare cases where it's an independent agency that's not headed by a commission. It's headed by one single director who's appointed by the president. And once he is appointed, even the president can't remove him, except for cause, for if the inefficiency, neglect, and malfeasance in office.
Makes him one of the most powerful people in Washington, right?
Right. And then the other, and then what's kind of the icing on the cake is the other way that Congress, if they're from the other party or doesn't like the, agency, or at least wants to control the agency, they can cut their funding. And so what they did was they funded it through the Federal Reserve, which is a bank, and earns its own profits and doesn't get money from Congress. So basically Congress can't cut their budget, which is how they might rein in another, an agency that they didn't like. So it's between those two factors, they really answer to almost nobody.
Sounds like Senator Warren is pretty smart. Whoever was behind that structure. All right, what I want to do, I think, would be a good place to start, because everybody knows about this. Wells Fargo just had a huge scandal. 2 million unauthorized bank and credit card accounts were opened without the customers knowing that. That would seem like a classic CFPB case. What was their role in it? It
looked like that at first, and the way it rolled out, which, by this point with the CFPB, they're still so focused on everything is the headline and, what's it going to look like. And so if there was that kind of fraud was exactly what the Bureau was formed to stop. But what in fact happened was, for 2 years they were going into the bank with their examiners, looking at everything, and if anybody noticed it, and as far as I know from the examiners I've talked to, nobody really seemed to catch it. But if they did, they didn't think it was worth addressing. And then at the end of 2013, the Los Angeles Times ran a big article expose, and it caught their attention because some of the employees who felt they were fired because they were not opening enough accounts sued Wells Fargo. And so when the lawsuit came out, and I guess one of the people, the plaintiffs, called the newspapers, somehow that got to them, and they did a very lengthy, in-depth article. Now, at that point, you would think, okay, well, the CFPB definitely knows about it now. They're going to stop it. But in fact, they let the comptroller of the currency and the Los Angeles city attorney lead the investigations, and the CFPB went off and did something else, and whatever else they were doing. And after about 3 years, when it was all over, they came in, and because the Dodd-Frank law gives them so much more leverage to assign penalties, they negotiated the largest penalty of the three of them. So theirs was $100 million. The city attorney, I think, was $50, and the comptroller was $35 million. And so the news stories rolled out, and and the lead story was Consumer Financial Protection Bureau protects consumers, stops this fraud. But in fact, they really just came in at the end and negotiated the biggest fine. And not only that, but the $100 million didn't go to consumers. The $100 million went to the CFPB or the Treasury, or whatever penalty monies goes to the Bureau.
Yeah, that stunned me. Only $5 million went to consumers?
I think less than $5 million. Probably $2 or $3 million. Now, the reason, perhaps if you want to try to, I'm not defending them, but if you want to kind of explain the way that played out, was that a lot of the accounts were opened and closed, and the consumers never knew it. And it's a little bit hard to say, well, what was actually the harm, the financial harm? I mean, obviously, it's just generally terrible. People should not be able to open accounts in your name. But the question was, what was the quantifiable harm to consumers? And the real harm would be if you went out to get a mortgage, and because you had opened other credit card accounts or bank accounts or whatever, your credit score went down.
Yeah.
And you would end up paying a higher mortgage interest rate on your mortgage for many, many years to come. So the harm was probably much more than the $2 or $3 million that they calculated.
Yeah, I would think they would be liable, able to get civil damages like that for really what's fraudulent abuse. But your main point, though, is that while this should have been at the heart of the CFPB mission, they really basically just came in at the end and took the credit.
Right, and
the money.
Well, and the theory is, and if you want to say, well, you're protecting consumers, you're saying, okay, well, this huge fine will stop banks from doing this in the future. And if you saw the way it played out, you have to first of all keep in mind $100 million is a lot of money to the average person, but to Wells Fargo, it'll make 1 quarter's profits not look so good. It won't destroy the $100 million in and of itself won't destroy the bank. And
no, for instance, J.P. Morgan paid $30 billion in mortgage, from the mortgage scandal.
Right. Right. I mean, and if you just literally look at it as, okay, well, that's $100 million less profits in 1 quarter, but the stock price was totally destroyed because basically a lot of people lost faith in the bank and, were saying, well, should I keep my money in Wells Fargo anymore? And then on top of that, the head of the bank came in and didn't convince Congress and didn't basically stop the bleeding. And so he got fired. And between him and the woman who was running the incentive programs, they had to give back $60 million. That's what will make the next bank executive make sure he's careful.
That's a good way to end the first segment. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell on the Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. Go to the biztalkradio.com, find the station nearest you, listen over the Internet, access our podcast. We're going to get into some of the specific complaints and faults that sort of, in your opinion, helped destroy the agency. And we're back for our final segment with Ron Rubin, who's written a very insider piece on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We're going to talk now about what should happen to this agency, and I think you wanted to finish up on payday loans.
Yeah, so the bottom line of payday loans is if you have a better offer to make people, then sure. Then if you can figure out a way to offer loans to people at a lower interest rate, that's good. But just taking away their only source of credit without offering them something better is not helping them. And that's really kind of the problem, is that they hate the payday loans so much, and they hate the idea of this high interest rate so much that they're willing to take away loans that leave people high and dry without any other source of credit.
And that leads into a good place to finish this up. What should happen to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau? It seems like we have an example of a mission that had no oversight, too much power, and ended up doing a lot of damage, perhaps inadvertently, or perhaps directly as a result of the fact that they narrowed the people that they had there. So tell us what should happen to the agency and what should happen to the current director, Richard Cordray.
Congress has basically been passing bills since 2011 to change mostly two things, which is give the funding back under the control of Congress, and make this into a bipartisan commission. And every time they tried to do it, the Democrats said, you just want to harm consumer protection. You don't care about consumer protection. So those are really the two major reforms that you can look at. The question of a commission, I mean, ultimately, if you want it to be independent, ultimately it should be a commission because, well, first of all, it would have to be under the recent Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals decision. Mm-hmm. It would if you wanted to take away the president's ability to remove members, the leaders, then it would have to be a commission, not a single director. If you're going to get there, personally, I think it's not a bad place to end up, but I think the Republicans now need some time to go in there and balance it out before we then, somewhere down the line, merge it into or morph it into a bipartisan commission.
And is that by that you mean like the SEC?
Yes. And again, since my experience for many years is at the SEC, I have to tell you, when I worked there, I was never even aware of which party was controlling the commission. There always seemed to me to be a very professional. The commissioners were knowledgeable. They may have had different perspectives. But that's the idea of a commission, is that you have a lot of experts, and the reason you're going to allow them to be independent is because they're experts, and they're going to be, operating in good faith. Ultimately. So
you think that you do not think it should be abolished?
Oh no, not. I mean, I think that there are real purposes for the agency. For example, before, one of the reasons you needed an agency like this was that the bank regulators, their first priority was always safety and soundness of the banks. And then, they didn't really focus on consumer protection. And in fact, if you think about it, higher fees, overdraft fees, even if maybe they're not so fair, mm-hmm. that kind of works in favor of safety and soundness because the banks are making more money. So there was kind of a built-in conflict of interest there, and a lot of consumer laws were not being properly enforced. But it needs, first of all, it needs to be not an all-powerful, vast, overreaching bureaucracy, which is what it is. And ultimately,
that's a great point at the heart of your argument. Does it need to have the consumer advocacy need to be balanced with either fairness or at least the costs to business of doing this? I mean, how do you get them to have more of a perspective that right now it's almost like business is bad, consumers are getting screwed?
Well, the irony of it all is that a lot of the things, and if you look at most of my articles, I try not to write like, gosh, they're awful, they're bad, I don't like the agency, da-da-da. Generally, the punchline of my articles is what you're doing is actually hurting consumers. You're not even helping consumers. So, for example,
good point.
One of the things that they're working on is debt collection rules. And one of the proposals that may end up becoming in the rules, or at least if the rules go through, is that debtors are, the minute the debt collector calls, you can say, I never want you to call me again. That's it. I'm in control of my debt collection. And, what ends up happening? People end up getting sued because if the debt collector can't talk to you, then the next step is to sue them. Or if you can't collect on debt, what happens? Ultimately, interest rates go up because the cost has to be passed on. And so...
Yeah, that's the part that's missing, right, from the agency or the Bureau.
Well, that's economics. I mean, and in a lot of ways, economics is a difference between short-term and long-term thinking. And, so there needs to be a kind of a fuller perspective. It doesn't need to be like, I'm your class action lawyer and I'm going to just get everything I can for you today. Consumer protection doesn't mean necessarily consumer advocacy. There's a real difference there. One is law enforcement and the other is basically advocacy for your client.
Interesting. Let me ask you this. Trump is about to take over, and of course he ran The Apprentice where he issued "You're fired." Should the director, Cordray, be fired?
I mean, personally, I don't like to see a good person be fired, whether or not they've done a good job or not.
Has he done a good job?
He's done some things well and some things not well. But, I would also say in general, I read somewhere once that nobody should ever have the same job for more than 5 years. And the director job was supposed to be a 5-year job, but because he was first recess appointed and was in a recess appointment for a year and a half, and then, before his full term came, at this point he's been almost 6 years. He's been at the agency, for 6 years, but he was nominated, was it January of 2012. So now we're coming up on 5 years. Once he was nominated, for all intents and purposes, even though he officially wasn't running the agency, he was. And then once the recess appointment was in January of 2012. So he actually has been, running things for more than 5 years.
Thanks to Ron Rubin. He's taken a very gutsy, I guess, our overall interest look at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And you could read the article in the National Review, The Tragic Downfall of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. You've been listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Thanks to Ron Rubin. Thanks to our national audience for listening. And we'll see everybody next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.